Here's the thing that gets me about the mountain men. They weren't supposed to exist. Think about it. In 1804, when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark into the western wilderness, he was essentially asking them to walk off the edge of the known world. Beyond the Missouri River, nobody knew what was out there. Maybe mountains, maybe deserts, maybe nothing at all. The maps just stopped. But here's what Jefferson couldn't have predicted, and what makes this story so remarkable. Those 33 men who followed Lewis and Clark up the Missouri weren't just exploring. They were creating a completely new kind of human being, a person who could survive where no civilized man had any business surviving. John Colter was the first. Now, Colter wasn't special when the expedition started. Just another Virginia farm boy who'd answered the call for adventure. But when Lewis and Clark reached the Mandan villages on their way back east in 1806, when every sensible man was counting the days until he'd see civilization again, Colter made a decision that should have killed him. He asked to leave the expedition. Can you imagine that conversation? Thanks for the safe passage, captains, but I think I'll stay here. In the middle of nowhere, alone, with winter coming, Lewis and Clark said yes. They had to. Colter had served faithfully for 2 years, and mountain law, even before there were mountain men, respected a man's right to choose his own death. So there's John Colter, watching 32 men paddle away down the Missouri, leaving him alone in a wilderness that stretched for thousands of miles in every direction. No supply lines, no backup. No way home, except his own 2 feet and whatever skills he could develop fast enough to stay alive. What happened next changed everything. Colter didn't just survive that first winter. He thrived. He learned to read sign like a Crow warrior, to make fire in blizzards, to cache supplies where bears couldn't reach them. But more than that, he discovered something that would draw hundreds of desperate young men into the mountains over the next 40 years. He found the place we now call Yellowstone. Picture this. Colter, alone, snowshoes strapped to his feet, walking through a landscape that doesn't seem quite real. Steam rising from the ground like the earth is breathing. Pools of water hot enough to cook meat. Geysers that shoot boiling water 100 feet into the air with a sound like thunder. When Colter finally made it back to civilization and tried to describe what he'd seen, people laughed. They called it Colter's hell. Figured the isolation had driven him mad. Because in 1808, the idea that such places could exist in North America was like claiming you'd found dragons. But here's what made Colter different from every other explorer who'd ever lived in this continent's history. He didn't just find wonders. He found a way to live among them, permanently. The man spent 3 years alone in that wilderness. 3 years? Modern humans have psychological breakdowns after 3 days without their phones. Colter was out there for 1,000 days, and when he finally emerged, he wasn't broken. He was transformed into something new, something harder, something that could survive where ordinary men would die before sunset. And word spread, not through newspapers or official reports. Mountain men have never been much for paperwork. Word spread through the networks every frontier society develops. Traders, trappers, Native American bands, rivermen. Stories about a white man who lived like a ghost in the high country, who could appear out of nowhere, trade for supplies, then vanish back into mountains that swallowed men whole. The stories attracted exactly the kind of people you'd expect. Young men with nothing to lose. Runaway slaves seeking freedom beyond any master's reach. French Canadian voyageurs who'd been paddling wilderness rivers since childhood and wanted to see what lay beyond the water. Veterans of the War of 1812 who'd tasted violence and found civilian life too tame. But mostly, they were desperate. Here's what I mean by desperate. In 1820, if you were a 20-year-old man in Missouri with no land, no skills, and no prospects, your options were limited. You could work someone else's farm for wages that barely kept you fed. You could try your luck in the growing cities back east, where factory work was dangerous and paid almost nothing. Or you could sign up with one of the fur companies heading west. The fur companies made it sound almost easy. Enterprising young men, that's how the advertisements read, to ascend the Missouri River to its source. They're to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. What they didn't mention in those advertisements was that enterprising meant willing. To fight grizzly bears with knives, that employed meant probably going to die in ways that would horrify your family. That the source of the Missouri was farther from civilization than most people could imagine, but the money was real. A successful trapper could make $3,000 in a good season. To put that in perspective, a common laborer back east made maybe $250 a year, if he was lucky. So we're talking about the difference between scraping by and genuine wealth. The kind of money that could buy land, start a business, set a man up for life. Of course, you had to survive to spend it. The man who really turned this from individual adventure into organized business was William Henry Ashley. Now, Ashley was a politician from Missouri, a lieutenant governor, no less, but he had the kind of calculating mind that could see opportunity where others saw only death. In 1822, Ashley placed that famous advertisement in the Missouri Republican to enterprising young men. The subscriber wishes to engage 100 men to ascend the River Missouri to its source. They're to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. 100 men. Ashley wasn't thinking small. He was planning to create an army of mountain men, a human resource that could strip every beaver from every stream between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean. The wealth that represented millions of dollars in today's money was almost beyond calculation. But Ashley was smart enough to know that money without the men to earn it was worthless. So he didn't just recruit anybody. He looked for specific types. Men who were already halfway to becoming the kind of person who could survive alone in the wilderness. French-Canadian voyageurs were perfect candidates. These men had been paddling canoes through the northern wilderness for generations. They could read water like other men read books. They were used to isolation, hardship, cold. They already lived more like Native Americans than white settlers. Runaway slaves were another source. Men like Edward Rose, who'd escaped bondage and had literally nothing to lose by heading into the unknown. For them, the mountains represented something no amount of money could buy: true freedom. Freedom to succeed or fail based on their own skills, not the color of their skin. And then there were the young men from the border states: Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri. Places where civilization was still new enough that boys grew up knowing how to hunt, how to track, how to read sign. Men like Jim Bridger, who was barely 18 when he answered Ashley's call, but who already had the instincts that would make him legendary. Now here's what's fascinating about this moment in history. Ashley was essentially creating a new profession. There was no training manual for mountain men. No school that could teach you how to survive a grizzly attack, or set traps in frozen streams, or navigate by stars when blizzards lasted for weeks. The only way to learn was to do it. And most of the men who tried died, but the ones who survived became something unprecedented in human history. They became people who could live anywhere, survive anything, adapt to conditions that would kill modern humans in hours. And it all started with that decision John Colter made in 1806. The decision to walk away from safety and discover what lay beyond the edge of the map. By 1825, there were maybe 300 of these men scattered across the western mountains. 300 individuals who had learned to call home a landscape that covered more territory than all of Western Europe. Who could find water in deserts, build shelters that would keep them alive at 40 degrees below zero, and navigate through blizzards that erased every landmark. They were about to create something that had never existed before and would never exist again. A society of absolute equals, bound together not by law or government or tradition, but by the simple understanding that any one of them could save your life, or take it. But first, they had to survive their apprenticeship. And that apprenticeship was about to be written in blood. The thing about apprenticeship in the mountains, there was no gentle learning curve. You either figured it out in your first few weeks, or you became a cautionary tale that other mountain men would tell around campfires for the next 20 years. And the stories they told? Let me tell you, they weren't bedtime stories. Take Hugh Glass. Now, Glass wasn't a greenhorn when he signed up with Ashley's brigade in 1823. The man was already in his 40s, which made him practically ancient by mountain man standards. He'd been a sailor, maybe even a pirate. The stories vary. Point is, he knew hardship. He thought he knew survival. He had no idea. It was late August 1823. Glass was scouting ahead of Major Andrew Henry's party near the Grand River in what's now South Dakota. Beautiful country, really. Rolling hills, clear streams, the kind of landscape that makes you think nature is benevolent. Glass was probably thinking about beaver sign, maybe keeping an eye out for hostile war parties. What he wasn't thinking about was the sow grizzly with 2 cubs that he was about to stumble into at close range. Now here's the thing about grizzly bears that most people don't understand. They're not just big, though this one probably weighed 600 pounds. They're not just strong, though a swipe from those claws can take a man's head clean off. They're fast. A grizzly can run 35 miles per hour. For comparison, the fastest human who ever lived could barely hit 28. Glass had maybe 2 seconds to react. He managed to get his rifle up, fired 1 shot, but a single ball from a flintlock might as well be a mosquito bite to an enraged grizzly protecting her cubs. What happened next? Well, it redefined what the human body can survive. The bear hit Glass like a freight train. Claws that could rip through buffalo hide tore him open from scalp to thigh. Those jaws that could crush elk bones, clamped down on his skull. The bear literally picked him up and shook him like a rag doll. But Glass did something that saved his life, something that goes against every human instinct when you're being mauled by 600 pounds of fury. He went limp, played dead, let that bear maul him without fighting back, because fighting back would have triggered even more savage attacks. The bear mauled him for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, left him torn open, bleeding, barely breathing. Then she gathered her cubs and disappeared into the brush, satisfied that the threat was dead. Glass wasn't dead, but he should have been. When Henry's party found him, they couldn't believe he was still breathing. His scalp was hanging in ribbons. His ribs were broken. There was a gash in his throat so deep you could see his windpipe. His leg was mangled, blood everywhere. They cleaned his wounds as best they could, sewed up what could be sewn, and waited for him to die. Because that's what you did in the mountains when a man was hurt beyond saving. You made him comfortable and waited, but Glass didn't die. Hour after hour, day after day, he just held on. Finally, Henry made a decision that would haunt him for years. He couldn't wait any longer. Winter was coming. Hostile tribes were in the area, and the party needed to move. So he asked for volunteers to stay with Glass until the end, then catch up with the main party. 2 men stepped forward. John Fitzgerald, an experienced hand who knew the country, and Jim Bridger, 18 years old. This was going to be Bridger's first real test as a mountain man. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because what happened next depends on who's telling it, and mountain men were never known for sticking strictly to facts when a good story would do. The version that became legend goes like this. Fitzgerald and Bridger waited 2 days, maybe 3. Glass seemed to be getting worse, not better. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Death was clearly just hours away, so they took his rifle, his knife, his possible sack with all his gear, and they left, not out of cruelty. Understand that. They honestly believed Glass was dying. And in the mountains, you don't leave good equipment to rot with a corpse, when that equipment might save someone else's life. It was practical, logical. It was also the biggest mistake they could have made, because Hugh Glass wasn't dying. Hugh Glass was getting angry. When Glass finally regained consciousness, and we're talking about a man who'd been mauled by a grizzly, remember, he found himself alone. No rifle, no knife, no supplies, in hostile territory. With winter approaching, any reasonable person would have given up, would have made peace with God and waited for the end. Glass got up and started crawling. Now think about this for a minute. Really think about it. This man had a broken leg, ribs that punctured his lung every time he breathed. wounds that were already infected and crawling with maggots. He was 200 miles from the nearest fort, across country that was crawling with Lakota war parties who would torture him to death just for entertainment, and he started crawling toward Fort Kiowa. The journey took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of crawling, sometimes walking when he could manage it, across 200 miles of wilderness. He set his own broken leg using strips of hide and pieces of wood. He let maggots eat the infected flesh from his wounds because maggots only eat dead tissue. They were actually keeping him from dying of gangrene. When he found a rattlesnake, he ate it raw. When wolves brought down a calf, he drove them off and ate the meat they'd killed. He drank water from streams and puddles, slept in the open, kept moving when every cell in his body was screaming at him to stop. But here's what kept him going. It wasn't survival instinct, though Glass had that in spades. It wasn't fear of death. Glass had already made peace with dying. It was revenge. Glass was crawling 200 miles across hostile wilderness for one reason: to look Jim Bridger and John Fitzgerald in the eyes and get his rifle back. To face the men who'd left him for dead and demand an accounting. When he finally dragged himself into Fort Kiowa in October, the men at the fort thought they were seeing a ghost. Glass was supposed to be dead. Henry's party had reported his death weeks ago. But here he was, alive, talking, demanding to know where he could find Bridger and Fitzgerald. Now here's the part of the story that makes it legendary among mountain men. When Glass finally tracked down his equipment and the men who'd taken it, he didn't kill them. He didn't even fight them. He forgave them. Bridger was just a kid, Glass said. He'd made a mistake, but it was an understandable mistake. Fitzgerald had honestly believed Glass was dying. In their position, Glass might have done the same thing, but the message was clear to every man in the mountains. Hugh Glass had crawled 200 miles for revenge, then demonstrated that revenge wasn't as important as survival. He'd proven that a mountain man could endure absolutely anything if his will was strong enough. More importantly, he'd set a standard, the Hugh Glass standard. If you wanted to call yourself a mountain man, you had to be the kind of person who could crawl 200 miles with a broken leg and infected wounds. Then forgive the men who'd left you for dead. Most men couldn't meet that standard. Which brings us to the other side of the apprenticeship story, the men who didn't make it. For every Hugh Glass who survived his blood apprenticeship, there were 5 or 6 graves scattered across the high country. Men who froze to death their first winter because they didn't know how to build proper shelters. Men who starved surrounded by game because they couldn't read sign well enough to track it. Men who got lost in blizzards and wandered in circles until exhaustion took them. The companies tried to give greenhorns basic training, but there's only so much you can teach someone before you turn them loose in country that wants them dead. Jedediah Smith, and we'll talk more about Smith later, developed something like a curriculum for new men. First lesson, how to make fire in any conditions. Not just when you have dry kindling and a sheltered spot. When it's raining, when it's snowing, when you're so cold your fingers won't work properly and your life depends on getting warm in the next hour. Mountain men carried fire-making kits that were almost mystical in their simplicity. Flint and steel, obviously, but also charcloth made from old shirts, tinder from the inner bark of certain trees, pine pitch scraped from pines and mixed with gunpowder for emergency use. The best mountain men could make fire with wet wood in a snowstorm. They had to. Their lives depended on it. Second lesson, how to read the country. This wasn't just about navigation, though knowing how to find north by the stars was crucial. This was about reading the land like a book. Understanding that willows meant water, that certain types of grass indicated good camping spots, that broken branches and disturbed earth might mean a war party had passed through recently. But the most important lesson wasn't technical. It was psychological. Smith would tell new men, the mountains don't care if you live or die. The weather doesn't care. The animals don't care. The only thing that determines whether you see another sunrise is what's between your ears. Mental toughness, the ability to keep thinking clearly when you're so hungry you're dizzy, so cold you can't feel your hands, so exhausted you're seeing things that aren't there. The ability to make life or death decisions when making the wrong choice means leaving your bones for the wolves to scatter. This is where most men failed, not because they couldn't learn the skills. Though the skills were incredibly demanding, they failed because they couldn't handle the isolation. The constant awareness that death was always just one mistake away. The knowledge that if something went wrong, nobody was coming to save them. Modern people have no frame of reference for this kind of isolation. We're connected to other humans 24 hours a day through phones, internet, social media. The idea of spending 5 months without hearing another human voice is literally incomprehensible to us. Mountain men not only endured that isolation, they learned to love it. They developed relationships with their horses and mules that were deeper than most human friendships. They talked to the animals constantly, not just because it helped maintain sanity, but because those animals often knew things that could save your life. A horse's ears could detect sounds human ears would miss, sounds that might mean a war party was approaching. A mule's reluctance to enter certain areas might indicate predators or unstable ground. Smart mountain men learned to read their animals like instruments, using them as early warning systems for dangers the human senses couldn't detect. By 1825, the survivors of this blood apprenticeship had become something unique in human history. They weren't just frontiersmen. America had plenty of those. They weren't just hunters or traders, though they were both. They were human beings who had adapted to live successfully in an environment that killed most people who tried. They were about to create something that had never existed before and would never exist again. A society based on absolute equality, where the only thing that mattered was competence, where your background, your education, your family name meant nothing, where the only question that mattered was, can you survive? And once a year, these solitary masters of survival would gather in one place to prove just how far from civilization they'd traveled. They called it Rendezvous, and it was about to become the stuff of legend. Now here's something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to really think about it for a minute. By 1825, scattered across maybe 2 million square miles of wilderness, that's an area larger than the entire European continent, there were roughly 300 men who had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had learned to live as individuals in a landscape that would kill most people in a matter of hours. And once a year, these ultimate individualists would gather in one place for what became the most legendary celebration in the history of the American frontier. They called it Rendezvous. And if you think you understand what that means, you don't. Picture this. Henry's Fork of the Green River, summer of 1825. For 11 months of the year, this valley is empty except for wildlife. Beautiful country, mountain peaks reaching toward heaven, crystal streams, meadows that stretch for miles. Silent as a cathedral, then in July it explodes into life. From every direction they come. Single riders leading pack trains loaded with beaver pelts. Small groups of 2 or 3 men who've wintered together. Larger brigades representing the big companies. But they're not just white men, and this is crucial to understand. Crow bands with hundreds of horses and their finest trade goods. Shoshone families with children who've never seen white settlements. Nez Perce warriors wearing their most elaborate regalia. Within a week, what had been empty wilderness becomes a city. A temporary, impossible city of maybe 1,500 people representing dozens of different cultures, all gathered for one purpose, to trade everything they have for everything they need to survive another year in the mountains. The economics of Rendezvous were staggering. A successful trapper might arrive with 300 beaver pelts at $6 a pound, and this is when common laborers back east were making maybe $1 a day. We're talking about serious money. $1,800. $2,000. Some men made more in one season than most Americans made in a decade. But here's the thing about mountain men and money. They understood something that modern people have forgotten. Money is only valuable if you can spend it. And in the middle of the Rocky Mountain wilderness, 100 miles from the nearest settlement, money was just pieces of metal. What mattered was goods, gunpowder, lead for bullets, new rifles to replace the ones broken or lost during the year, knives, traps, coffee. And if you think coffee isn't important to survival, try staying alert during a night watch when hostile war parties might be approaching and you haven't had caffeine in 6 months. But the trading was just the beginning, because these men had been alone, truly alone, for months at a time. They were desperate for human contact, for news, for the chance to prove themselves against their peers, the competitions that developed at Rendezvous. They beggared description, shooting contests where the target was a nail driven into a tree at 100 yards. Not hitting the tree, hitting the nail. Jim Bridger could supposedly split a bullet on the blade of an axe and hit 2 targets simultaneously. Kit Carson, who was maybe 5'6" and barely weighed 140 pounds, could put 6 shots through the same hole at 50 paces, wrestling matches that made modern professional wrestling look like ballet. These weren't men who'd gotten soft sitting behind desks. These were human beings who'd spent months swinging axes, hauling traps, fighting for their lives against grizzly bears and hostile warriors. When Joe Meek and Jim Bridger locked up in a wrestling match, the ground shook. Men placed bets on whether the contest would end with broken bones or just unconsciousness. Horse, racing on mounts that had never seen a racetrack, but had learned to navigate mountain passes and river crossings that would challenge modern all-terrain vehicles. The Crow and Nez Perce brought horses that seemed to fly across the prairie, while mountain men rode animals that might not be pretty, but could carry a man and his gear through country that would kill ordinary horses. And then there was the drinking. Now, I need to be careful here because I don't want to romanticize alcoholism. But what happened at Rendezvous wasn't just drinking. It was a kind of ritualized celebration of survival that modern people can barely comprehend. These men had spent months in conditions of constant stress, constant danger, constant awareness that a single mistake could mean death. They had earned the right to let loose in ways that would terrify civilized society. The whiskey arrived by pack train from Missouri, raw, unaged stuff that could probably power a steam engine. It sold for $3 a pint when the same whiskey cost 25 cents in St. Louis. But mountain men paid the premium gladly because they weren't just buying alcohol. They were buying temporary amnesia from a year's worth of accumulated stress. The stories that came out of those drinking contests. Hugh Glass supposedly drank a quart of pure alcohol in one sitting and remained conscious enough to arm wrestle a Crow chief. Joe Meek claimed he once drank so much that he forgot how to speak English and conversed entirely in Crow for 3 days. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. They became part of the mythology that held the mountain man community together. But here's what made Rendezvous truly remarkable. For 3 weeks every summer, it created something that had never existed in American history, a completely egalitarian society. Think about this. Back in the settled states, society was rigidly hierarchical. Your birth determined your opportunities. Your family name opened doors or kept them closed. The color of your skin defined your place in the world. At Rendezvous, none of that mattered. Edward Rose, the son of a white trader and a Cherokee woman, commanded the same respect as any man in the mountains. His mixed heritage, which would have made him an outcast in white society, was an asset in the mountains, where understanding different cultures could save your life. James Beckwourth, born into slavery, became a chief among the Crow and was treated as royalty at Rendezvous. His knowledge of Crow customs and territory made him invaluable to traders and trappers alike. The only thing that mattered was competence. Could you survive alone in the wilderness? Could you read sign? Could you set traps in frozen streams? Could you navigate by stars? Could you fight when fighting was necessary and negotiate when negotiation was better? If you could do those things, you were a mountain man. If you couldn't, you were dead, and therefore not a problem. This created a kind of aristocracy of skill that was unique in American history. Men like Jim Bridger, who by 1825 was still in his early 20s but already spoke a dozen Native American languages fluently, who could describe every water source between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast, who knew the location of passes through mountain ranges that most Americans didn't even know existed, or Kit Carson, small and unimpressive looking until you saw him move. Carson could track a war party across rock, navigate through Apache territory where larger men feared to tread, and shoot a rifle with accuracy that bordered on supernatural, or Joe Meek, whose booming laugh could be heard across an entire rendezvous camp. Meek collected stories like other men collected beaver pelts, the time he escaped a Blackfoot war party by hiding inside a rotting buffalo carcass for 3 days, breathing through the bullet hole that had killed the animal. The time he talked his way out of captivity by convincing his captors he was crazy, then proved it by eating soap and pretending to have visions. These men had become the lords of a kingdom that covered half a continent. A kingdom with no laws except the natural law of survival. No government except the informal councils that formed when decisions needed to be made. No currency except skill, courage, and reputation. And for about 15 years, from roughly 1825 to 1840, they ruled that kingdom absolutely. The Native American tribes understood what mountain men represented. These weren't settlers looking to claim land or soldiers looking to conquer territory. These were individuals who had learned to live in the wilderness without changing it, who took only what they needed and left no permanent mark on the landscape. Different tribes developed different relationships with mountain men. The Crow, who had been fighting the Blackfoot for generations, saw mountain men as valuable allies who could provide guns and ammunition. Crow women married mountain men not just for love or economic advantage, but because these unions created political alliances that benefited both cultures. The Shoshone, who had been devastated by smallpox and warfare, found in mountain men a source of trade goods and military support that helped them survive as a people. Sacagawea's people, remember, they had good reason to trust white men who came in peace. The Blackfoot, on the other hand, saw mountain men as competitors for resources and territory. Blackfoot warriors made a sport of hunting isolated trappers, taking their scalps as trophies and their equipment as prizes. This created a state of low-level warfare that lasted for decades, but even hostile tribes respected mountain man competence. A Blackfoot warrior who killed a mountain man in single combat gained enormous prestige precisely because mountain men were so difficult to kill. They had become the ultimate test of a warrior's skill, the women who married mountain men, and this is something that gets overlooked in a lot of frontier histories, weren't passive participants in this society. They were teachers, partners, and often the difference between survival and death. A Crow woman named Mitapa, married to Manuel Lisa, revolutionized winter survival by teaching mountain men to layer clothing like her people had done for centuries. Soft rabbit fur against the skin, then deerskin, then buffalo hide with the fur turned inward. This created insulation systems that kept men alive in temperatures that would kill through modern synthetic materials. Native American wives taught their husbands to identify medicinal plants, to read weather patterns, to understand animal behavior in ways that no white education could provide. They served as translators not just of language, but of entire ways of thinking about the natural world. And they bore children who inherited the best survival traits of both cultures. Mixed heritage sons and daughters who could track like Crow warriors and shoot like Kentucky marksmen, who spoke multiple languages and understood multiple ways of living in the same landscape. By 1830, rendezvous had become an institution that defined the mountain man era. The great supply companies, Ashley's successors, the American Fur Company, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, built their entire business models around these annual gatherings. But there was something else happening at Rendezvous that nobody fully understood at the time. These celebrations were becoming wakes, celebrations of a way of life that was already beginning to die, because far away, in London and Paris, fashion houses, silk hats from China were starting to replace beaver felt. And when fashion changed, economics changed. And when economics changed, everything else would follow. See, lords of the High Kingdom were about to discover that even the most competent men in history couldn't survive a force. They couldn't fight with knives or rifles or courage. They couldn't fight changing markets. You know what separates the mountain men from every other group of survivors in American history? They developed a system for passing on knowledge that was more sophisticated than most universities. Think about that for a minute. These were men who supposedly lived as isolated individualists, each man for himself, survival of the fittest. But the reality was completely different. The mountain men created an informal but incredibly effective educational system that could turn a greenhorn into a competent wilderness survivor in a single season if he lived long enough to learn. The master-apprentice relationships that developed in the mountains weren't based on formal contracts or written agreements. They were based on something much more fundamental, the understanding that knowledge meant the difference between life and death, and that dead apprentices couldn't carry on the traditions. Old Gabe Bridger became the most famous teacher of them all. By 1830, Jim Bridger was still only 26 years old, but he'd already survived more close calls than most men could imagine. He'd been left for dead with Hugh Glass, and learned from that mistake never to abandon a partner too quickly. He'd fought Blackfoot warriors, grizzly bears, mountain lions, and survived blizzards that killed grown trees. More importantly, he'd learned to think like the mountains thought. When Bridger took on an apprentice, and he was careful about who he chose, the first lesson wasn't about trapping or shooting or navigation. It was about observation. See that bend in the stream there? Bridger would ask, pointing to what looked like any other curve in the water. What do you notice about it? The greenhorn would look and see. A bend in a stream, look again. Not at the water, at the banks, at the trees, at the grass. Slowly the apprentice might start to notice details. The grass was greener on one side. The trees grew differently. There were scratches on the bark at a certain height. Elk, Bridger would explain. They come to drink here regular-like. See how the grass is worn? That's a game trail. See those scratches? That's where the bulls rub their antlers. This isn't just a bend in a stream, it's an elk highway. You set your camp here, you'll have fresh meat whenever you need it. But more than that, you also need to know that elk attract predators. Wolves, mountain lions, bears. Set your camp wrong, and something might decide you look tastier than elk. This was education at its most practical. Every piece of information connected to survival. Nothing abstract, nothing theoretical. Everything designed to keep you alive one more day. The construction of winter quarters required engineering knowledge that would impress modern architects. Choose the wrong location, and you'd freeze to death, or get snowed in with no escape route. Choose the right location, and you could survive months of temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. Bridger taught apprentices to look for valleys that were protected from prevailing winds but still had escape routes if hostile war parties discovered the camp. To position cabins so the door faced away from the direction storms usually came from, but still allowed quick access to water and firewood. The cabin construction itself was a marvel of practical engineering. Logs had to be chinked with a mixture of mud, grass, and pine pitch that wouldn't crack in extreme cold. The roof had to be steep enough to shed snow, but strong enough to support the weight of several feet of accumulated snowfall. The chimney had to draw properly. Poor ventilation could kill you with smoke inhalation as surely as exposure could kill you with cold. But the most crucial knowledge wasn't about construction. It was about supplies. Food preservation in the mountains required techniques that Native American peoples had developed over thousands of years. Making pemmican, dried meat pounded with fat and berries, created nutrition so concentrated that a handful could sustain a man for days. But the process had to be done exactly right. Too much moisture and the meat would rot. Too little fat, and it wouldn't provide enough calories for the extreme energy demands of mountain life. Jerky wasn't just dried meat. It was carefully prepared insurance against starvation. The meat had to be cut to specific thicknesses, dried at precise temperatures, and stored in containers that would keep moisture out, but still allow air circulation. Mountain men developed techniques for smoking meat that created flavors we can barely imagine today. Rich, complex tastes that came from burning specific combinations of woods and herbs. But here's what really separated the masters from the amateurs: medical knowledge. There were no doctors in the mountains, no hospitals, no pharmacies. If you got hurt or sick, you either healed yourself or you died. So mountain men became experts in frontier medicine that combined Native American plant knowledge with practical surgery techniques that would make modern emergency room doctors uncomfortable. Setting: broken bones without x-rays or proper equipment required an understanding of anatomy that most medical students would envy. Mountain men learned to feel for the alignment of bone fragments, to create splints from available materials, and to immobilize injuries in ways that allowed healing while still permitting enough movement to survive. Treating infections without antibiotics meant understanding which plants had antiseptic properties. Willow bark for pain relief, the same compound that would later become aspirin. Echinacea for immune system support. Golden seal for wound cleaning. Pine needle tea to prevent scurvy during long winters without fresh vegetables. But the most important medical skill was surgery. Not the delicate, sterile surgery of modern hospitals, crude, desperate surgery performed with hunting knives, and no anesthesia beyond whiskey and something to bite down. On mountain men routinely performed operations that would challenge modern surgeons, removing arrowheads from their own bodies, amputating frostbitten fingers and toes, setting dislocated joints, treating gunshot wounds. All of this done in frontier conditions, with tools that were never designed for medical use. The psychological knowledge was equally sophisticated. Mountain men understood that isolation could destroy a man's mind as surely as cold could destroy his body. They developed techniques for maintaining mental health that psychology wouldn't. Discover for another century. Talking to horses and mules wasn't just eccentric behavior. It was a deliberate strategy for maintaining verbal skills during months of solitude. Mountain men who spent entire winters alone would carry on elaborate conversations with their animals, not because they thought the animals understood, but because they knew that humans who stop talking eventually lose the ability to communicate with other humans. They created mental exercises, memorizing poetry, working mathematical problems, telling themselves stories that kept their minds sharp during the long, dark months when there was nothing to do but survive. Some mountain men could recite the entire Bible from memory. Others had memorized Shakespeare. Joe Meek claimed he knew every bawdy song ever written and could sing them for days without repetition. The marriage customs that developed between mountain men and Native American women created stable relationships that were crucial for survival. These weren't casual liaisons. They were carefully negotiated partnerships that benefited both individuals and both cultures. A mountain man who married into a Crow or Shoshone family gained access to survival, knowledge that no white education could provide. He learned to read weather patterns by observing animal behavior, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to understand the seasonal movements of game animals, to navigate by natural landmarks that remained constant even when snow erased all trails. Native American wives gained access to trade goods, protection, and economic opportunities that improved their families' chances of survival. They also gained partners who understood that their knowledge was valuable. Mountain men who had learned the hard way that listening to your wife's advice about weather or animal behavior could save your life. The children of these marriages inherited survival advantages from both cultures. They grew up speaking multiple languages, understanding different approaches to the same challenges, adapting techniques from both their parents' traditions. These mixed heritage children often became the most successful guides and interpreters of the later frontier period. But perhaps the most important knowledge that masters passed to apprentices was philosophical. Mountain men developed a worldview that allowed them to function in conditions that would drive most people insane. They learned to accept death as a constant companion without becoming paralyzed by fear. They understood that the mountains didn't care about human hopes or dreams or plans. The mountains simply were, and human survival depended on accepting that reality without bitterness or complaint. They developed a relationship with pain that modern people find almost incomprehensible. Pain wasn't something to be avoided at all costs. Pain was information. Pain told you when you were pushing too hard, moving too fast, taking unnecessary risks. Learning to interpret pain correctly could save your life. Most importantly, they learned to find joy in circumstances that would crush ordinary men. The satisfaction of making a perfect shot when meat meant the difference between life and death. The pride of building a shelter that would keep you alive through a blizzard. The simple pleasure of hot coffee on a morning when the temperature was 20 below zero by 1835. This educational system had created a group of men who represented the pinnacle of human adaptation to wilderness conditions. They could survive anywhere, adapt to anything, overcome challenges that would defeat modern technology. But they were about to face a challenge that no amount of skill or knowledge or courage could overcome. They were about to discover that individual competence, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't protect them from economic forces they couldn't control. The beaver market was about to collapse. And when it did, it would take down everything the mountain men had built. Here's something that's going to sound crazy, but I need you to understand how completely it changed everything. In 1835, a gentleman in London decided he preferred silk hats to beaver felt. Then another gentleman made the same choice. Then another. Within 5 years, this shift in fashion preference, something that happened in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs thousands of miles from the Rocky Mountains, would destroy a way of life that had taken 40 years to create. The mountain men, who could survive grizzly attacks and Blackfoot war parties and blizzards that lasted for weeks, were about to be killed by market forces they couldn't fight with rifles or knives or courage. Let me put the economics in perspective for you. In 1830, beaver pelts were selling for $6 a pound in St. Louis. A successful mountain man might bring in 300 pounds of beaver in a good season. $1,800. Remember, this is when common laborers back east were making maybe $250 a year. By 1838, those same pelts were bringing $1 a pound. By 1840, you couldn't give them away. What happened? Silk manufacturing in China had reached the point where silk hats were not only more fashionable than beaver felt, they were cheaper to produce. European hat makers discovered they could import silk, manufacture elegant hats, and sell them for less than it cost to ship beaver pelts from the American mountains. The mountain men watched their entire economic foundation crumble in the space of 5 years. Now, you might think this is just another story about economic disruption. Industries rise and fall, technologies change, people adapt. But what happened to the mountain men was different. This wasn't just an industry being disrupted. This was an entire way of life being made obsolete overnight. These men had spent decades learning skills that suddenly had no economic value. They knew how to live in places where no one wanted to live, doing things no one wanted done anymore. They were masters of a profession that no longer existed. The 1840 rendezvous at Horse Creek was supposed to be a celebration. It turned into a wake. Only about 120 trappers showed up, down from over 600 at the peak gatherings of the early 1830s. The mood was different from the first moment men started arriving. You could feel it in the air. The desperation, the knowledge that something was ending. The trading was half-hearted. Supply companies had brought fewer goods because they knew demand would be low. Mountain men had fewer pelts because, what was the point? Why trap beaver when beaver wasn't worth anything? The competitions continued. The shooting contests, the wrestling matches, the horse races. But even these felt different, like men going through the motions of celebration while knowing they were really attending a funeral. Joe Meek, whose booming laugh had echoed across a dozen previous rendezvous gatherings, was noticeably quieter. Jim Bridger, old Gabe himself, spent more time staring at the mountains than participating in the festivities. Kit Carson was already talking about guiding wagon, trains, civilian families heading west to Oregon and California. The whiskey tasted bitter that year, but here's what separated the survivors from the casualties. Some mountain men saw the change coming and adapted before it was too late. Joe Walker had been reading the signs for years. Not the kind of sign that told you where elk were drinking or which way war parties had traveled, economic signs. The gradual decline in beaver prices, the increasing talk about silk hats in the eastern newspapers that occasionally made their way to Rendezvous. In 1833, Walker led an expedition to California, ostensibly to trap beaver, but really to explore new opportunities. What he found was a landscape that would soon be swarming with settlers. Walker mapped routes across the Sierra Nevada that would become highways for the gold seekers who arrived in 1849. By 1840, Walker wasn't trapping beaver anymore. He was guiding wagon trains, using his knowledge of water sources and mountain passes to help families reach California safely. He charged $100 per family for his services, more than many mountain men made in a poor trapping season. Jim Bridger made a similar transition, but in a different direction. In 1843, he established a trading post at what became Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming. Bridger understood something crucial. Even if people didn't want beaver pelts anymore, they still needed to cross the mountains. And crossing the mountains required knowledge that only mountain men possessed. Fort Bridger became a crucial supply stop on the Oregon Trail. Emigrant families could repair their wagons, rest their animals, and buy supplies for the most dangerous part of their journey. Bridger's knowledge of the country, which mountain passes were passable when, where to find water, which routes avoided hostile tribes, became more valuable than beaver pelts had ever been. Kit Carson followed a different path. His small stature and quick reflexes made him ideal for military scouting. When John C. Fremont began his famous Western expeditions in the 1840s, he hired Carson as his guide. Carson's knowledge of southwestern geography helped map territories that would soon become part of the United States through the Mexican-American War. But for every mountain man who successfully adapted, there were 5 or 6 who couldn't make the transition. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives in the wilderness, who had never learned to read or write, who had no experience dealing with the bureaucracies and legal systems of settled society, who had been lords of a kingdom that no longer existed. Some tried to continue trapping, even as prices continued to fall. They trapped smaller streams, moved into more remote territories, tried to make volume compensate for low prices. Most of these men simply vanished into the wilderness, their bones scattered across valleys that had once made them rich. Others attempted to find work in the settlements, but discovered that their skills didn't translate to civilian life. What good was the ability to set traps in frozen streams when you needed to work in a store or on a farm? How do you explain to a potential employer that you can navigate by stars and fight grizzly bears with knives, but you can't read a contract or keep account books? The psychological adjustment was even harder than the economic one. These men had lived as free individuals, answerable to no authority except the natural law of survival. Now they found themselves in a world of rules, regulations, bosses, and bureaucrats. A world where competence mattered less than connections. Where your ability to survive in the wilderness counted for nothing if you couldn't navigate social hierarchies. Many mountain men turned to alcohol, not the ritualistic celebration drinking of rendezvous, but the desperate drinking of men trying to escape from a reality they couldn't handle. They would show up in frontier towns, get drunk, get into fights, get arrested, and disappear again into whatever wilderness was left. The Mexican-American War, which began in 1846, provided temporary opportunities for some mountain men. Their knowledge of southwestern geography made them valuable as scouts and guides for military expeditions. But these were employee positions, not the independent contractor relationships they were used to. Kit Carson guided Fremont's expeditions through California. Jim Bridger scouted for various military commanders. Tom Fitzpatrick served as an Indian agent, using his knowledge of tribal customs and languages to negotiate treaties. But even these successful adaptations came with a cost. These men were no longer mountain men in any meaningful sense. They were employees of the United States government, bound by regulations and reporting requirements that would have been unthinkable during the Rendezvous era. The California Gold Rush, beginning in 1849, created one final boom for mountain man skills. Thousands of gold seekers needed guides to get them across the mountains safely. Men who had spent decades navigating wilderness trails could charge premium prices for their knowledge. But this was different from the beaver trade. The gold rush was about getting people across the mountains and out the other side. It wasn't about living in the mountains permanently. The mountain men became tour guides for their own former kingdom. By 1850, the transformation was complete. The men who had once been the masters of half a continent were either dead, drunk, or working for wages in a world they barely recognized. The bitter irony was inescapable. The mountain men's greatest achievement, mapping the West, finding the routes that made settlement possible, had made their own way of life obsolete. Every trail they blazed, every pass they discovered, every water source they identified made it easier for civilization to follow. Bridger's Pass saved emigrants thousands of dangerous miles. Sublet's cutoff reduced travel time to Oregon by weeks. Carson's knowledge of water sources prevented countless deaths from dehydration. But each piece of information they shared, each route they opened, brought more settlers west. And more settlers meant less wilderness. And less wilderness meant fewer places where mountain men could live as they had always lived. The mountain men had solved their own problem out of existence, but something else was happening that none of them fully understood at the time. The knowledge they had accumulated, the techniques for wilderness survival, the understanding of natural systems, the psychological frameworks that allowed humans to thrive in extreme conditions, was being lost as surely as the beaver trade itself. When the last mountain man died, humanity lost something it had taken 40 years to develop and would never be able to recreate. We lost the knowledge of how to live as individual human beings in landscapes that didn't care whether we survived or not. And once that knowledge was gone, it would become clear just how much we had given up in the name of progress. You want to know how completely the world had changed for mountain men? By 1850, Kit Carson was working for the United States government at $100 a month. Think about what that means. This was a man who had once made thousands of dollars in a single trapping season, who had been answerable to no authority except his own judgment and the natural law of survival, who had lived as a free individual in a kingdom that covered half a continent. Now he was filling out paperwork and filing reports with bureaucrats in Washington who had never been. West of the Mississippi River, the Mexican-American War, which raged from 1846 to 1848, gave aging mountain men one last chance to use their skills in something resembling their old profession. But it wasn't really the same thing. They were employees now, not the independent operators they had always been. John C. Fremont hired Carson to guide his expeditions through California during the Bear Flag Revolt. Carson's knowledge of southwestern geography helped the United States Army navigate territories that would soon become American soil. But Carson was no longer Kit Carson, master of the wilderness. He was Kit Carson, government employee, subject to military discipline and federal oversight. The transformation was even more dramatic for men like Jim Beckwourth. Beckwourth had been born into slavery, the son of a plantation owner and a slave woman. In the mountains, he had become a chief among the Crow people a position of genuine authority and respect that had nothing to do with the color of his skin and everything to do with his competence as a warrior and leader during the Mexican-American War. Beckwourth served as a scout and interpreter, using his knowledge of tribal customs and languages to help negotiate treaties and prevent conflicts. But he was doing this as a representative of the United States government, not as an independent agent operating by mountain law. The bitter irony cut deep. The very knowledge that had made mountain men valuable, their understanding of Western geography, their relationships with Native American tribes, their ability to survive in hostile territory, was now being used to help the federal government extend its control over the wilderness they had once called home. Jim Bridger's story illustrates the complexity of this transition better than any other. By the 1850s, old Gabe was in his 60s and nearly blind from decades of snow glare and sun exposure. His eyesight was so poor that he could barely see beyond a few yards. But his mental maps of the Western Territories were more accurate than any survey the government possessed, so the army hired him. They needed his knowledge to guide military expeditions, to locate water sources, to identify defensive positions, to predict where hostile tribes might establish camps. Bridger could still describe every creek, every pass, every valley between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast. But he was describing them to officers who were planning military campaigns, not to fellow mountain men planning trapping expeditions. The psychological adjustment was devastating for most of these men. They had spent their entire adult lives making life-or-death decisions based on their own judgment. Now they were being asked to follow orders from men who had never spent a night alone in the wilderness, who didn't know the difference between elk sign and deer sign, who couldn't navigate by stars or build a fire in a blizzard. Some mountain men couldn't handle the transition at all. Old Bill Williams, who had spent 30 years in the mountains and had gone more native than perhaps any other white man, continued trying to live the old way even as the world changed around him. Williams spoke multiple Native American languages fluently, had married into several different tribes, and understood indigenous cultures better than most anthropologists. In 1849, Williams was scouting for a military expedition in Colorado when he took a Ute arrow through the heart. He died in a canyon he had trapped for decades, killed by people who might have been relatives of his former wives. The irony was cruel. A man who had bridged cultures for 30 years, killed in a conflict between those same cultures and the government he was serving, the California Gold Rush, beginning in 1849, created one final economic opportunity for mountain man skills. Thousands of gold seekers needed guides to get them safely across the mountains. Men who had spent decades learning every trail, every water source, every dangerous passage could charge premium prices for their knowledge. But this was different from anything mountain men had done before. The Gold Rush was about getting people through the wilderness as quickly as possible, not about living in the wilderness permanently. The mountain men became tour guides for their own former kingdom, helping greenhorns accomplish in wagon trains what mountain men had once done alone and on. Foot Joe Meek, whose booming laugh had once echoed across rendezvous camps, found himself guiding families of farmers and merchants across trails he had helped blaze decades earlier. These weren't his people. They were settlers who wanted to get through the mountains and establish farms and towns on the other side. They had no interest in learning to live in the wilderness. They wanted to transform the wilderness into something that looked like the places they had left behind. The Civil War, which began in 1861, created a strange final chapter for many mountain men. They found themselves choosing sides based on old loyalties and new necessities, using their wilderness skills in service of a conflict that would determine the future of a nation most of them barely recognized anymore. Some mountain men served the Union cause. Jim Bridger, despite his failing eyesight, guided military columns through territories he had trapped as a young man. His mental maps were still more reliable than any official survey, and his knowledge of defensive positions and water sources proved invaluable to Union commanders. But other mountain men found themselves on the Confederate side, not necessarily because they supported slavery, but because they distrusted federal authority and preferred the idea of independent states to centralized government control. Men like Bill Williams, before his death, had used their knowledge of hidden valleys and secret trails to run guns and supplies through Union lines. The industrial nature of the Civil War had little use for mountain man skills. This was a conflict fought with railroad timetables and telegraph communications, with mass-produced rifles and artillery. Individual competence in wilderness survival meant less when battles were decided by logistics and industrial capacity. Still, some mountain men found niches where their skills remained valuable. They served as scouts and spies, using their ability to move through hostile territory undetected. They guided cavalry raids through difficult terrain. They provided intelligence about enemy movements in areas where conventional reconnaissance would have been impossible. But these were supporting roles in someone else's war, not the independent operations that had defined mountain man life during the beaver trade era. As the war progressed and industrialization accelerated, it became clear that mountain men represented something that had no place in the modern world. They were living reminders of a time when individual competence mattered more than organizational efficiency, when personal relationships were more important than institutional structures, when survival depended on adapting to natural systems rather than controlling them. The deaths of the last mountain men were often as dramatic as their lives had been. But the drama felt different now, obsolete, anachronistic, liver-eating. Johnson, so named for his supposed consumption of Crow enemies' organs in revenge for his wife's murder, died peacefully in a veterans' home in California in 1899. The man whose name had once struck fear into the hearts of warriors across the Northern Rockies spent his final years telling stories that younger people dismissed as tall tales. Jim Bridger died in 1881 on his farm in Missouri, blind and largely forgotten. The man who had once been able to navigate by stars, who could describe geysers and petrified forests that scientists wouldn't discover for decades, spent his final years spinning yarns that his neighbors thought were products of senile dementia. Hugh Glass, the man who had crawled 200 miles with a broken leg and infected wounds, died in a skirmish with Arikara warriors in 1833. But by then, his legendary survival had already become the standard by which all mountain men measured their own endurance. The knowledge died with them. And this is the part of the story that should haunt us. When the last mountain man died, humanity lost something that had taken 40 years to develop and could never be recreated. We lost the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned to live successfully in environments that would kill most modern humans in a matter of hours. We lost techniques for reading natural signs that no university could teach. We lost psychological frameworks for dealing with isolation and stress that no therapy could replicate. We lost the understanding of how individual human beings could adapt to landscapes that didn't care whether they survived or not. Most importantly, we lost the knowledge of what humans are capable of when survival depends entirely on individual competence, creativity, and courage. The mountain men had proven that people could live anywhere, survive anything, adapt to conditions that seemed impossible. But they had also demonstrated the price of such adaptation, the willingness to abandon comfort, safety, and civilization itself. Their ghosts still haunt every wilderness trail, reminding us of capabilities we once possessed and freedoms we can never recover. They represent the road not taken, the path toward individual mastery instead of collective security, and they whisper questions that we're not sure we want to answer. What have we gained by choosing safety over freedom? What have we lost by preferring comfort to competence? And what would we do if circumstances forced us to rediscover the skills that allowed human beings to thrive in places where civilization offers no protection. The mountain men knew the answers to those questions, but we buried that knowledge with them, and we are probably not strong enough to dig it up again. Now I want you to do something for me. I want you to imagine, and I mean really imagine, that you've just been dropped into the Rocky Mountains in the middle of January, 1830. No cell phone, no GPS, no rescue beacon. Just you, the clothes on your back, and whatever skills you think you have. How long do you think you'd last? If you're like most modern people, you're probably thinking in terms of days, maybe a week if you're particularly resourceful. You've seen survival shows on television. You know you're supposed to find shelter, build a fire, locate water. How hard could it be? Here's the truth that's going to shock you. You'd be dead before sunset, not because you're weak or stupid or unprepared. You die because you have no comprehension, none, of what survival actually requires in conditions that mountain men considered. Routine, let me start with something as basic as making fire. You reach into your pocket for your lighter. There is no lighter. You remember seeing people make fire by rubbing sticks together. Easy enough, right? You find 2 pieces of wood and start rubbing. 5 minutes later, your hands are raw and bleeding. The wood is barely warm. You have no tinder, nothing that will catch a spark even if you manage to create one. And the temperature is dropping as the sun goes down. Mountain men carried fire-making kits that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Flint and steel, obviously, but also char cloth made by charring cotton or linen in an oxygen-free environment. Tinder made from the inner bark of birch trees or cedar, processed to create material that would catch fire from the smallest spark. Pine pitch mixed with gunpowder for emergency situations. Dry grass and shredded bark stored in waterproof containers, and they could create fire in any conditions. In rain, in snow, in wind that would blow out modern matches. With wood so wet it seemed impossible to burn. They could do this because they understood fire as a process, not just as something that happened when you flicked a switch. You don't have that knowledge. You don't have those materials. And hypothermia is setting in. At 68 degrees Fahrenheit, your body starts shivering to generate heat. At 64 degrees, your thinking becomes impaired. At 60 degrees, you lose fine motor control. Your fingers stop working properly, making it impossible to perform the delicate tasks that fire-making requires. By the time your core temperature drops to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you're unconscious. At 85 degrees, you're dead. In January in the Rockies, with no fire and inadequate clothing, this process takes about 2 hours. But let's say somehow you manage to get a fire started. Now you need shelter. You look around for caves. There are no caves. You think about building some kind of lean-to, like you saw in a movie once. You gather some branches and try to prop them against a tree. The wind blows your construction apart in minutes. Snow starts falling, soaking through your inadequate modern clothing. Your fire, which you couldn't properly maintain anyway, dies. Mountain men knew how to build shelters that would keep them alive in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. They understood that shelter wasn't just about keeping rain off your head. It was about creating a micro-environment that your body heat could warm efficiently. They built wickiups from pine boughs, layered in specific patterns that shed water while trapping insulating air. They dug snow caves when conditions required it, understanding that snow could provide insulation if you knew how to use it properly. They created reflector walls that bounced heat from fires back toward sleeping areas. Most importantly, they understood that in extreme cold, your shelter and your fire had to work together as a system. The fire provided heat, but the shelter had to capture and hold that heat while allowing enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. You don't know any of this. Your shelter collapses, your fire dies, and now you're not just cold, you're wet. Wet clothing in freezing temperatures will kill you faster than no clothing at all. But let's imagine you somehow solve the fire and shelter problems. Now you need food. You see tracks in the snow, animal tracks. You follow them thinking you might find something to hunt. You don't have a weapon, but maybe you can make a trap or find an animal that's already dead. The tracks lead you in circles for hours. You're following deer tracks, but you don't know that deer in winter move in complex patterns designed to confuse predators. You're burning precious calories, chasing animals you have no ability to catch or kill. Meanwhile, you're walking past dozens of potential food sources that you don't recognize. Pine nuts that could provide essential fats, inner bark from certain trees that could supply carbohydrates, rose hips that could prevent scurvy, winter-killed animals that scavengers haven't found yet. Mountain men could identify hundreds of edible plants and knew when and how to harvest them. They understood which parts of animals were most nutritious and how to prepare them to extract maximum caloric value. They knew how to preserve meat through smoking and drying, how to render fat for long-term storage, how to make pemmican that would keep them alive through months of winter. You don't know any of this. You're starving in the middle of a landscape that could feed you if you only knew how to see it. But the physical challenges, devastating as they are, aren't even the worst part. The psychological challenges would destroy you even faster. Modern humans are accustomed to constant connection with other people. You check your phone dozens of times per day. You're surrounded by human voices, human faces, human activity. The idea of spending 5 months without hearing another human voice is literally incomprehensible to most people today. Mountain men spent their winters in complete solitude. 5 months, 6 months, sometimes longer. They developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining psychological health during this isolation. They talked to their horses and mules constantly, not because they thought the animals understood, but because they knew that humans who stop talking eventually lose the ability to communicate effectively with other humans. They created elaborate mental exercises, memorizing poetry, working mathematical problems, telling themselves stories to keep their minds sharp during the long, dark months when there was nothing to do but survive. Some mountain men could recite the entire Bible from memory. Others had memorized Shakespeare's complete works. Joe Meek claimed he knew every song ever written and could sing for days without repetition. These weren't parlor tricks, they were survival techniques. Mental tools that kept them sane during isolation that would drive modern people to psychotic breaks. You don't have these skills. You don't have this mental discipline. After 3 days alone in the wilderness, you'd be talking to yourself just to hear a human voice. After a week, you'd be seeing things that weren't there. After a month, if you somehow survived that long, you'd be permanently damaged, and we haven't even talked about the medical challenges yet. There are no hospitals in the mountains, no emergency rooms, no ambulances. If you get hurt, and in wilderness conditions, getting hurt is not a matter of if but when. You either heal yourself or you die. Mountain men routinely performed medical procedures that would challenge modern emergency room doctors. They removed arrowheads from their own bodies using hunting knives. They set broken bones without x-rays or proper equipment. They treated infections without antibiotics. They amputated frostbitten fingers and toes. They performed surgery on themselves with no anesthesia beyond whiskey and something to bite down on. They could do this because they understood that pain was information, not something to be avoided at all costs. They knew which plants had medicinal properties and how to prepare them. They understood basic anatomy well enough to treat injuries that would kill modern people. You don't have this knowledge. You don't have this tolerance for pain. The first time you cut yourself badly, which would happen within days in wilderness conditions, you'd probably bleed to death, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. But here's what really separates you from the mountain men. They had made peace with death. They understood that the mountains didn't care whether they lived or died, that the weather had no consideration for human hopes and dreams, that wild animals would kill them without malice or mercy, simply because that's what wild animals do when threatened or hungry. This acceptance of mortality wasn't fatalistic, it was liberating. Because once you truly accept that death is always possible, you stop wasting energy on fear and start focusing on the skills and decisions that might keep you alive. One more day, modern people have been protected from this. reality for so long that we've lost the psychological frameworks that allow humans to function effectively when death is a constant possibility. We've been trained to believe that safety is normal, that survival is guaranteed, that someone will always come to rescue us if things go wrong. In the mountains, no one is coming to rescue you. Your survival depends entirely on your own knowledge, skills, and mental toughness. And if you don't have those things, which you don't, you die. The mountain men proved something that modern civilization has made us forget. Humans are capable of surviving almost anything, but only if they're willing to pay the price that survival demands. That price includes accepting constant discomfort, living with pain as a daily reality, making life or death decisions with incomplete information, enduring isolation that would break most minds, developing skills that take years to master, and mistakes that kill you while you're learning. Most importantly, it requires abandoning the expectation that life should be safe, comfortable, or fair. The mountain men understood that survival is not a right. It's an achievement, something you earn every day through competence, courage, and the willingness to keep going when everything inside you is screaming to quit. You don't have that understanding. You don't have those skills. You don't have that mental toughness, which is why you'd be dead before sunset. And here's the question that should haunt us. In becoming safe, comfortable, and civilized, what essential human capabilities have we lost? The mountain men represent the outer limits of human adaptation, what our species is capable of when survival depends entirely on individual competence. They proved that humans can live anywhere, survive anything, adapt to conditions that seem impossible. But they also demonstrated that such capabilities come at a price that modern people are unwilling to pay. We've chosen safety over freedom, comfort over competence, civilization over individual mastery. Those are probably the right choices for building stable societies and comfortable lives. But the mountain men whisper a question that we can't quite silence. If circumstances forced us to rediscover those capabilities, could we? Or have we traveled so far down the path of civilization that we can never find our way back to the skills that once allowed human beings to thrive in places where nature offers no mercy and survival is never guaranteed? The ghosts of Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger and Kit Carson suggest that we probably don't want to know the answer to that question, because the answer would probably terrify us.